Hey there, my name's Porsha Lauri. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. And today I'm bringing something a little bit different to my channel, as per usual lately. We are getting really close to maybe the actors strike coming to a wrap soon. So I think we'll be able to kind of return to our normal form. But in the meantime, I have been working on some different kinds of videos, and today is one of those different kinds of videos. So if you're a fellow millennial like myself, you might have been wrapped up in this recent pop culture whirlwind, the NSYNC, are they or are they not going back on tour again? And I have been so overwhelmed thinking about the possibilities of what it would be like if they went on tour again, the possible opportunity to see them live finally, because I was a huge NSYNC girly back in the day, but I was never able to go to one of their concerts. So with that being said, with this return of NSYNC with this new single out, I really started to think about the kind of golden era of the boy band boom, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So today I'm going to be giving you a little bit of history as to where boy bands came from, where it originated, where it got that kind of really dumb, silly name, and where it's at today. So if that sounds interesting to you, make sure you stick around. And as always, if you enjoy my opinion on all things pop culture, music, movies, TV shows, what have you, do me a solid and drop a like on this video, then run over to that subscribe button, hit the bell next to it so you can be notified every time I upload. And as I've been mentioning, I am also on a podcast. It's called the Cinema Sitdown. You can find a link down below in the description. It's just me, my boyfriend, and his best friend, and we just sit around, shoot the shit, and talk about movies. If that sounds of interest to you, make sure you go check us out. We're available on Spotify and iTunes, all linked down in the description below. So without too much further ado, I say we just go ahead and get into it. So the origins of the boy band actually date all the way back to the 1800s. There were these groups of typically African-American men known as barbershop quartets, and these African-American men would typically be singing old folk songs, hymns, and popular songs of that era. They would sing together and create these really beautiful harmonies without any accompanying instruments. And these barbershop quartets would share a lot of the idiosyncrasies that we would later see in boy bands of the modern era, where they would utilize their different ranges and meld them all together to create a kind of melodic harmony. A lot of these barbershop quartets were used by these white minstrel shows where they would be showcasing Black stereotypes. And then eventually, because this became a more popular genre, I guess you could say, this was then adopted into popular white culture, and the original origins of it became less and less known. Now, with the growing steam of the barbershop quartet and that kind of bleeding into mainstream pop culture, we saw the rise of the doo-wop group. Now, these would be definitely our predecessors to the boy band. Now, doo-wop groups were not specific to men only. There were female doo-wop groups. However, the title is most closely linked with male singing groups of that era. Typically, these male groups would consist of younger men in high school or in their early 20s, singing songs about hormones, heartbreak, and love, in your teenage life, which was, again, slightly unheard of. Most of the main big singers of the era were of the older generation, so they were, being targeted towards that. But with doo-wop, we see the music industry starting to utilize this kind of untapped market known as the young adult or teen sector. And this is something, again, when we get into the actual boy bands of the modern age, we will see how the music industry really targeted them towards this audience and then flipped it to make these huge crazes. Now, when doo-wop groups were coming up, of course, the most popular ones were typically white-fronted ones. However, these African-American bands also started to create mainstream success, and this is, I think, in the 50s is where we have the introduction of Motown Records. So there was starting to be carving out a space for Black people to be in the mainstream music industry. At first, they didn't know how to categorize this type of genre because, of course, we can't just be in the same genre because we look different. So at the time, this was often referred to as race music. But because that was, the terminology was not great, we were, this is Martin Luther King era, we are starting to see less segregation. This later became known as the genre of rhythm and blues, or what we call today R&B. So this new R&B genre would consist of groups such as the Temptations, the Drifters, and New Edition that we would see come up a little bit later in the late 70s, early 80s. Now during this time, boy groups were doing really well, but again, they were still known as like doo-wop, or they would be in the pop and or R&B genre. We do start to see kind of the formulations of what would be the eventual boy band, but as per now, we weren't actually utilizing that terminology. Now, there was a journalist who originally credited the Beatles as kind of beginning the boy band craze, the mania around teenage girls and what they like to listen to. However, in more recent modern terminology, we no longer consider the Beatles to be necessarily a quote-unquote boy band. I will get into the terminology of boy band a little bit later because I have some further questions for other bands of my generation that were considered boy bands that I don't think necessarily fit this stereotype or this genre, but we'll dive into it when we get there. So again, as we're moving through the decades, we're really seeing this boy band become a bigger and bigger phenomenon. In the 80s, we also saw bands like Menudo, who I believe was started in Mexico, but please correct me if I am wrong, but they are a Latin boy band, and they were kind of known because Menudo would do this thing where they would cycle out their members. So they were really, really, really trying to push this towards a teen audience. And so the boys would be in the band, and once they got into a certain height, age, whatever the case may be, they would kick out that member and replace them with a younger, newer member, and thus keeping the band kind of constantly rolling, having a Rolodex of members, if you will. And if I'm pretty sure I'm correct, Menudo is still around to this day. I was never personally a Menudo fan. However, there was a song that my dance teacher used to use when I was in community college, and I remember I loved it so much, we would use it as a warm-up. I asked her who it was, and she was like, it's Menudo. So it was that, my generation's Menudo. I didn't even know that they had still been around. Something I kept reading in my research for boy bands is people kept bringing up New Edition, and I feel like as much as they're part of the boy band craze, they were never credited with being like originators of the genre, and they absolutely should be. New Edition has an insane band history. If anyone is interested in kind of looking further into how they got started, all of the crazy antics that happened during their years active and where they're at now, let me know. I was doing some like side quests during making this video, and New Edition, I just didn't know anything about them besides, like, the only thing I knew about New Edition when I started to research about boy bands was that Bobby Brown was in New Edition, and then Bobby Brown and like The Crack is Whack and like Whitney, and like that's really all I knew about it. But there's so much more to dive into. So if you're interested in any of that tea, let me know. There was a record producer named Maurice Starr, and he was very inspired by the success of New Edition, and he thought that he could kind of recreate that magic. Thus, we have New Kids on the Block. Now, New Kids on the Block, even though I do believe the Temptations and New Edition and the Jackson 5 are these huge inspiration for boy bands, I can't deny the fact that New Kids on the Block was its own huge phenomenon and explosion. If you're unfamiliar, New Kids on the Block was a very, very popular boy band of the late 80s and early 90s, and you might recognize them because Marky Mark's older brother, Donnie Wahlberg, someone in the comments I'm sure will correct me if I'm wrong, but they were just these adorable kids from Boston. They got Boston accents, so I assume they're from Boston. Correct me if I'm wrong. But they just basically set the world on fire in terms of their huge audience. I think they changed the game in terms of what capabilities a boy band really could have on the wallets of the music industry. Something that I picked up on just as a boy band fan as a kid is that oftentimes these boy bands would get their start across the pond or, in Europe. They would start there and then they would bring their music to the US. New Kids on the Block had quite an impact in other foreign countries before they had a huge impact here. And this started to snowball with European music industry now joining in on the boy band craze. Now, this is where the term boy band is really defined. Boy band has been defined many different ways, with the most popular definition being a harmonic group of male identifying people whom typically dance and sing without instruments, which is why bands like the Beatles wouldn't necessarily count towards this specific genre. However, I have seen numerous articles refer to like the Jonas Brothers as being a boy band. However, they play music. But technically, the Jonas Brothers are not a boy band. But I digress, it's just my own little problem with this. So many people and journalists believe the 90s to be the absolute height of the boy band craze, and I can't say that I differ in opinion too much. Earlier in the decade, I believe we see a lot more R&B, adult-focused boy bands such as All for One, Color Me Bad, or a personal favorite of mine, Boyz II Men. These bands were dominating the charts, and not only dominating in the urban categories or areas, but across mainstream music as well. In 1992, Boyz II Men, who were considered proteges of Bill Bev DeVoe, and if you don't know who Bill Bev DeVoe is, they were predecessors of New Edition. They were some members of the band that had gone on their own side quest and created a secondary band, if you will. And they were actually approached by Boyz II Men. Boyz II Men knew that they were performing at this place in their city, so they went down, they got backstage, and they were able to perform a cappella in front of them to just try to get their name out there, try to do some networking. As Bell Biv DeVoe did later on exchange numbers with them, bring them into the studio, and ultimately help them get their first record deal, as they were also producers of that record. Pretty cool. We would see Boyz II Men have a record-breaking 13-week streak at #1 on Billboard with their song End of the Road, only to be broken by another record of theirs, I'll Make Love to You. Now, the latter half of the 90s would take us into my era of boy bands. This is where we have the introduction of Lou Pearlman, who was inspired by the success of New Kids on the Block, or what we call them now, NKOTB. You know what? We're going to talk about Lou later, but Lou did bring us Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, LFO, O-Town. The last half of the 90s really was dedicated to serving towards that teen female demographic. Also in the late 90s, over in South Korea, this is where we saw the emergence of what would be known today as K-pop. K-pop would emerge during this decade as well, citing Xiao, Taiji, and the Boys as the beginning of this very popular hybrid genre we know today, originally called rap dance. Now, of course, during the height of the boy band craze, MTV most definitely tried to make a couple bucks off of it by creating their own parody silly boy band version called Together. So Together was comprised of a bunch of actors portraying the typical stereotypes of what makes a boy band. The pretty one, the class clown, the jock, the sensitive guy, and the youngest one. And this was a very popular thing. I believe they even had a whole album. I remember hearing some of their songs on the radio, and I thought that they were a legitimate band. It's not until I was doing research where I was like, oh, that was a joke. Got it. I think they did a TV movie for MTV, but I never saw the movie, so there was no connection there. Now, when we fast forward to the early 2000s, I think something that really marks a change in the media was there was a writer's strike during this time in the early 2000s, which meant that there was a halt on television, on movies, and whatnot, as we're seeing right now in 2023. Now, during this time, network execs were scrambling to still create programming that would bring viewers in, and the new thing that took off during that time was reality television. We saw a few shows pop up where they were creating boy bands. To me, the most popular of this genre is a show called Making the Band. Now, originally this show aired on ABC, and the first band that was ever made on the show was a band called O-Town, who went on to actually make it, like, I think 2 or 3 albums, and they had some moderate success. Now, Making the Band did go on to make other types of bands. I believe it was eventually bought by Viacom because it then eventually became an MTV show where Diddy made 2 different bands, one called The Band, which was a co-ed rap group, and the second, Danny B. Kane. But the first iteration was an all-male boy band, and it would show the cycle of finding the right members, them becoming a group together, living together, and recording their first album and their first music video. All relatively interesting in the beginnings of like reality television. And we would see this kind of formula continue on for a few more years, even into X Factor, where Simon Cowell famously put together what we would know now as One Direction. But like I said earlier, the 90s was really the height of the craze, and by the 2000s, numbers had begun to start dwindling in terms of how successful these groups were. By this time, many of the groups were either not together, they were on hiatus. Some members of the band would go off to make solo records, looking at you, Justin, and music would be switching into its next big thing of the time, which would be the rise of emo or pop punk, power pop, however you want to look at it. This would give us bands like My Chemical Romance, All American Rejects, Simple Plan. And these bands did share a lot of the characteristics of the standard boy band type, where we would have a sensitive one, we would have like the good-looking guy, the lead singer, who always amasses their own sort of fan base based on that alone. However, they were not doing coordinated dance moves, and they were a lot more into taking down the man. Now, I almost think that there was an attempt at a resurgence to bring kind of the glory of the boy band era back to life in the 2010s. This is when we saw One Direction being put together, and bands like The Wanted from the UK would be making some headway on the radio. Unfortunately, this didn't result in like a massive, huge return to form like we saw in the 90s. It was more of a passing trend, a passing craze. We even saw like kids television networks getting in on the fun with bands like Big Time Rush, that was kind of formulated like the Monkees. So the Monkees in the 60s was a response, America's response, if you will, to the Beatles. And it was a television show with a fictitious band, and it would watch them go get into all these hijinks, and then they'd have some type of performance at the end of every episode. And Big Time Rush was a similar kind of thing. It was like a band of guys living in a house, getting into hijinks, and occasionally they would sing to you. The Jonas Brothers also had a short-lived television show on Disney Channel. I didn't watch this. This was definitely after the era of where I wasn't watching this kind of programming anymore, but it was very successful. But I still don't consider them a boy band. I don't know. I have a hard time putting them in that category. I think they're a little beyond the boy band. You know what I mean? And as I've mentioned numerous times before, K-pop has become a huge genre here in the United States. And in 2013, we saw the introduction of K-pop being put onto Billboard, with BTS going on to receive the first Billboard Awards for their song Mic Drop. So that's a little bit of the history of boy bands, but I thought it would be fun to talk about some of the juicier things about boy bands. So let's get into a few topics that I thought were wildly interesting. Anytime you're talking about musicians, I feel like there always needs to be a segment where we talk about someone signing a bad deal. So I mentioned him earlier, and now we're going to get more into the details of this man. But there's a man named Lou Pearlman, and he is responsible for producing and funding some of the biggest boy bands that we know today. This list would include Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, LFO, and O-Town, amongst many others, and even some other girl bands as well. Now, Lou Pearlman claimed to own a private jet company, and he would rent out jets to famous rich people. And one time he came into contact with New Kids on the Block, who was desperately looking for a jet to get to some concert. Now, Lou was confused because this was just a bunch of teenage boys and they had the money to fly a private jet. How? And he learned about the fact that they were this huge boy band and how much money that they were bringing in. And this turned the wheels in his head and he realized, maybe music is something I should get into. Now, I'm not gonna delve too deep into Lou Pearlman. However, if you're interested in knowing more about his story, I will link the YouTube original by, I believe it's produced by Lance Bass. I will link that in the description below. It goes into more detail of what this man did. He basically screwed them all and he promised them the world and promised them fame and fortune. And as soon as they started to create money, constantly in this kind of cat and mouse game of never actually making enough money to make money, if that makes any sense. Now, ultimately, this led to several lawsuits. Lou was doing a whole bunch of other stuff outside of just music industry swindling. He was really out here scamming people. Eventually, the feds caught up with Lou Pearlman and he was sent to jail, where he ultimately passed away. Now, I couldn't talk about bad contracts and not bring up New Edition. Like I said, when I was researching into boy bands, I couldn't believe how many crazy things happened with this band. Now, New Edition went through a lot in terms of signing just terrible contracts. Their first contract was with Streetwise Records, and they swindled them so hard that they went on this huge tour after cutting their first album, and each band member walked away with $1.87. Like, they had a really big successful start, and to walk away with $1 in your pocket is a real big slap in the face. Now, unfortunately, these bad contract deals would continue for them over the next few iterations of their various albums and their various contracts. The way the music industry works is baffling to me, and the fact that it's like legal is also baffling to me. The music industry really is the devil, I'm pretty sure. Of course, if we're going to talk about bad contracts, we've also got to talk about what happens when you're in a group or put in a group with people you may or may not get along with. New Edition is notorious for the fact that their band members were not always getting along. Most famously, the giant feud between Bobby Brown and the rest of the band. The same can be said for the Temptations, whom experience a lot of ups and downs, a lot of drug issues with band members, and death, as the Temptations have been around since the 50s. And a more recent modern boy band example would also be B2K, whom I hadn't thought about in years prior to making this video. And when I was putting it together, I didn't realize that they had this huge blowout. Allegedly, Omarion has said that he is working on a docuseries documenting the rise and fall of B2K, and that in said documentary, he will be revealing a lot more inter-band personality issues and what really led to their most recent breakup. So that has yet to come out, but I am definitely going to be on the lookout for when it does. Now, besides inter-band turmoil, there's also band-to-band warfare, right? The one that I remember, obviously, most in-your-face one was the Backstreet Boys versus NSYNC. Now, because they were both signed under Lou Pearlman, there was kind of a band-on-band conflict going on. This was mostly created by Lou Pearlman himself, whether that be a tactic to get them to work harder or just a way to stir up drama. That is something that was taking place a lot during the beginnings of their career, but both bands have come out to say that they were actually all really friends, and when they were finally able to put down their guards, they were able to have these open conversations about Lou Pearlman, and they kind of helped each other to escape that bad situation. Something that I believe all celebrities, just period, have to deal with is the idea of stans and online rumors and tabloids. I think in boy bands, they don't get as much of this as, like, let's say, teenage women in the early 2000s, a la Britney and Lindsay. There was still a fair amount of fans trying to find out as much private information, creating problems within the band that didn't actually exist, but created great tabloid fodder. Now, I researched up and down to find any kind of weird rumors that were online about, the bands of my era, but I wasn't able to find anything. But something that I definitely wanted to touch on briefly is the infamous rumor about Harry and Louis of One Direction. But if you're unfamiliar with this theory online, there's basically a theory that fans began noticing that Louis and Harry seem to be very close physical friends. You would often see them with their arms around each other in photos, and they would usually be sitting next to each other. They had their own inside jokes, and they seem to be probably the closest members of this manufactured group. And then fans started picking up on this, and it created all this buzz on forums online, to the point where both Louis and Harry have said that they had to create distance between themselves in the public eye to stop these rumors from happening. And even though One Direction has been broken up, we still aren't seeing this particular rumor laid to rest. There are still people who are very emphatically believe that this wasn't just some online rumor, that these two were in an actual relationship together. While you might see this as like a no big deal, silly fan theory, it can also have harmful effects for those that are dealing with it. To be constantly asked if you are dating your friend is a huge invasion of privacy, in my opinion. And while I think it's all well and good to have your own little things that you pick up on that you think might be true and might be like make for a juicy or more interesting story than the one that's laid in front of you, I also think it could be harmful and damaging. So I mentioned this more as like a cautionary tale of like, just listen to their music and like don't overthink the rest of it if you can avoid it. And another commonality many of these boy bands unfortunately have is that they have broken up. So there are different kind of ways that these boy bands have broken up. Oftentimes they'll just go on a hiatus that never seems to end. We will often see them all depart to make solo records, but promise they'll come back together. Or the unfortunate happens and we have deaths within the band. I obviously will not be naming every single death, but I do want to mention LFO. They were one of my favorite bands growing up, and two of their members have passed away. So just I want to say RIP to both of them. But most of the time, these boy bands break up just because it's time to move on. The thing about boy bands, and I think this is important to note, is that typically they're talking about teen issues, breakups, makeups, having a crush, troubles with growing up. And so I think the reason that most of these bands don't do the long haul is that they don't always know how to mature the music with them. And if they're unable to properly do that or find a new audience that is still interested in their shtick, it will lead to them ultimately deciding to go their separate ways so that they can all, do whatever with the rest of their lives. Finally, we're at where are we today with boy bands? So I think the obvious answer is that K-pop has kind of reinvigorated this genre with bands like BTS and Stray Kids. We are seeing that there's a new generation who is still here for the silly dance moves, are still all crushing on the sensitive guy. And I don't think this genre is genuinely going to go anywhere. As I started off with in the video, NSYNC has made a reunion. They have just released their new song for the Trolls movie. And if you're like me, you are desperately hoping this was a soft launch to see what the fans would do. And maybe we're going to get an album. And if we don't get an album, could we at least get a tour? This is me begging you. I see what you're out here doing. I just feel like there's no reason to create all this buzz and to go on Hot Ones just to be like, we put out a song for the Trolls movie. Like, you're gonna make all of this to do for a song for a kids movie? There's something going on. There's something going on in that camp, and like Taylor Swift said, I need to know what's going on. I also want to mention how recently 98 Degrees had made a reunion and was like going on tour. And like one of the members was like, I think he was joking, but he low-key was throwing some shade at NSYNC for like taking away the steam from their reunion. And I feel like that's so fitting because 98 Degrees is like literally that band that was like always on the cusp of like they're about to be huge. And then they would never quite be huge. Like, were they big? Yeah. Did they make money? Yeah. But like, were they the same level as NSYNC and Backstreet Boys? No. So it's just, you know, even in 2023, they can't win. But that's pretty much going to wrap up what I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed talking about some of these boy bands and the origins of which they came from. If you want me to make more follow-ups to this, are you interested in the New Edition's history? Are you interested in the Temptations? Hell, I'll even do a 98 Degrees retrospective if you really want to. Let me know down in the comments below. And I may or may not be filming a tier list video that might have to do with NSYNC songs. So you might want to stick around my channel and subscribe so you don't miss that when I eventually might maybe do it. As always, if you enjoyed the video, please drop a like on it. That lets me know that you're enjoying the content and that I should make more of it. If you enjoy my opinion about pop culture stuff, make sure you hit that subscribe button and the bell next to it so you can be notified every time I upload. I'm on a podcast. You can check it out down in the description. Fingers crossed that the writers and actors strike ends soon so we can get back to regular programming. And until next time, I'll catch you guys later. Bye.